Welcome. We are reading and understanding the book of Revelation. As always, reading and understanding, beginning with the message, then seeking to understand the meaning. What does it say? What does it mean? With an acceptance of the promise of chapter 1, you can read and understand the book and receive a blessing. In chapters 18 and 19, we continue to read about God's judgments on Babylon or Rome. And this is going to be described, as I will point out in chapter 18, in 4 sections extending into chapter 19. We will see laments, and then ultimately we will see rejoicing in heaven. This section of the book of Revelation, I think, is not difficult to understand or interpret. Again, the phrase "in the Spirit" begins the third vision. The theme of this entire vision through the early part of chapter 21, the certainty of God's judgment on all enemies and the ultimate reward of God's faithful witnesses. So we keep in mind that the subject is the destruction of Rome. We stay on topic, try to avoid the temptation to insert ideas into the text, reading into the text rather than reading out of the text, what's called eisegesis instead of exegesis. So we begin with the laments that we read in chapter 18, the lament of the kings of the earth, the lament of the merchants of the earth, the merchants of wares, the seafarers. As we read chapter 18, verses 9 through 20, we notice the repetition. We see the repetition that comes in verses 10 and 16 and 18, woe, woe to that great city. And then chapter 19 will begin with heavenly praise for the truth and the justice of God's judgments on Rome, and we'll come to that in our next study. Now, in this third vision, the action moves rather quickly. Each part of the vision advances the plot or the message, yielding one overarching story. I think it's easy to miss the larger story if we give too much attention to detail. And so we want to notice how the various aspects of this storyline are sequenced, how they're connected. We are reading a description of God's judgment on Rome. After the detail of chapter 17, or at least the identity of the woman and the identity of the beast made clear, now we come to a section of laments concerning the fall of Babylon. So fallen, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. And we have the certainty of that voice from heaven. Woe to that great city. The kings of the earth who had committed adultery with her will weep and will mourn over her, according to verse 9. Then we have the lament of the merchants of the earth. And again, as they weep and mourn and cry out, beginning in verse 15, woe, woe to that great city, the reading of verse 16. And again, of the captains and those who travel on the sea, we have in verse 19, woe, woe to that great city, the lament of the merchants of wares, the lament of the wayfarers. And then in the last part of chapter 18, beginning in verse 21, we have a mighty angel. This is interesting. This is the third mighty angel that we've encountered in the book of Revelation. You may remember there was a mighty angel that gave the scroll that was opened by the Lamb, the first scroll of the apocalyptic vision, the central vision of the book. There was another mighty angel that was involved in giving the little open scroll to John in chapter 10 in verse 1. And now we have a third mighty angel, and we have a symbol, or if you will, a parable, the millstone cast into the sea, and the certainty, the violence of the judgment against Rome. Before we conclude our study of Revelation 18, or as we conclude and look ahead, perhaps, I want to think also with you about where we're going. I've already mentioned that in chapter 19, we will hear about rejoicing in heaven. We will also, in our next study, have more detail concerning the fate of the beast, the false prophet, a symbolic description of that battle, the Battle of Armageddon that was mentioned in chapter 16 between Christ and the beast and the false prophet, which will bring us to chapter 20. And thinking of chapter 20 in the overall context, this judgment on Rome will include the triumph of the martyrs' cause. The question of chapter 6 is being answered. That is, how long? It's a vision of hope. The victory will last longer than the trials. Again, pointing back to chapter 6, chapter 11, God's judgment against Satan has already been made clear in chapter 12. But here we will have more detail, amplifying the defeat of Satan. The abyss will be closed up, Satan bound. That will be for a symbolic time. And with the closing of the abyss, we have a reversing of what we were reading about in chapter 5. Excuse me, that should say chapter 9 in the fifth trumpet. And then in chapter 20, the fate of Satan is even clarified further as Satan again threatens the city of God and is overcome by God's power. We have Gog and Magog mentioned. This is the third reference in the book of Revelation to the text of Ezekiel, the Gog-Magog prophecy. And then finally, this judgment on Rome foreshadows judgment on all of God's future enemies. And finally, the third vision concludes in chapter 21, the ultimate victory, God's presence, the presence of the Lamb, and the fate of all evil. Well, I hope that may be helpful as we anticipate where we're going. We are reading about the destruction, more detail, the destruction, the overthrow, the conquest of the city of Rome, certainty that the persecution will end and that God will continue to protect his people as he controls history. Looking forward to being with you in our next study of chapter 19. Until then, may God richly bless us as we seek to understand the book of Revelation.